Hi guys, and welcome to the show. And we have got a VPASA here right next to me. I've got Thembi, and next to Richard Blow, we've got Fidel. Those are two VPA members. Maybe Thembi and Fidel, if you guys can just introduce yourselves as well.
I'm Fidel Hatebe. I'm the spokesperson for the VPSA. And I'm glad to be part of this conversation this morning. I really hope it will go a long way, really, in terms of sharing information, really, around this subject on vaping. Because, as we say, I mean, this is a fairly new thing that we are dealing with here, and there's still a lot that still has to be communicated to members of the public. So I hope this platform will really go a long way in terms of that objective.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Thembi Fidel. My company advises VPA on public affairs, specifically the process for this bill, in terms of some of the stages that it's going to go through, and the comment process that is currently open and will be closing now in August.
Okay. So in this show specifically, we've had two previous shows, but in this specific show, we want to zoom in on vaping in public. Now, this is part of the bill. It's a subsection of the bill. The first portion that I want to talk about here is literally just before page 10, or on page 10 somewhere. We have got smoke, and they classify what they mean by smoke. And when they say that, they say smoke means inhaled, exhaled, or otherwise have control over an ignited tobacco product, or a heated but not ignited tobacco product that produces an emission of any sort, or operate, otherwise have control over a electronic delivery system that produces emission of any sort. So when they say smoke in the bill, they're actually talking about anything, right? They're talking about heat not burns, they're talking about vaping devices, they're talking about cigarettes, smoke, okay? Then on page 10.2, control over smoking. Okay, so I thought it was important for us to know when they talk about smoke, it means everything, right? So when in page 10.2 they say control over smoking, they're actually talking about anything that has an emission, right? So now there's a lot over here. I think all of us are pretty affair with the smoking bans that is in the public at the moment. But now, of course, what is happening here is smoking is being piled in with vaping, right? So now smoking and vaping will be cut with the same knife if this bill is passed, if this portion of the bill is passed. So I'm going to run through it, and let's talk about some of these over here. So no person may smoke in an enclosed public place or enclosed workplace or on a public conveyance. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Any enclosed place that is not a public place or a workplace and that is within a prescribed distance from an operable window of ventilation inlet, entrance, or exit out of place where smoking is prohibited in terms of the paragraph, right?
Have they given any indication of what that minimum distance is going to be?
I don't see it in the bill.
No.
Look, just to make some just to make some general remarks on the detail. I mean, the substance of the bill. I think our position is that the bill is it's a bit too clumsy. It is overreaching in terms of what, for instance, it seeks to achieve. One, as a matter of principle, I mean, on our side, as the association, I mean, we are taking the approach that says split the two issues because they are not the same, and therefore you can't treat them like they are the same thing. They're not the same thing, and science squarely points to that the two are not the same thing. You know, we have no problems when it comes to traditional smoking products like your cigarettes, for instance. I mean, there's history behind that. When it comes to what we're dealing with here, we're dealing with something that is relatively new around the world. There's still a lot of work, some work at least, that is still being done. I mean, in the area of scientific research. But having said that, the evidence as things stand at the moment seems to be overwhelming. I mean, in terms of saying or suggesting that vaping it's much safer compared to your traditional smoking products like cigarettes, for instance. Two, when you come to dealing with the WHO, you know, there seems to be an element of fuzziness in terms of where it actually stands in relation to its position on this matter. But from our side, I mean, the long and the short of it is that this bill, as it stands, it is far too reaching. It is impractical. There's a lot that it fails to you know, to explain in terms of how it will really be applicable once if it gets to be implemented in the manner that it is at the moment.
What is the distance at the moment? Does anybody know? So thank you so much, Fidel. I think we largely agree with what you had said there. You know, they talk here about you know, how far you need to be away, but I know that's a law right now. Does anybody know what the law is in terms of?
Yes, currently there is no specific provision for distance from an opening. From about 2012, the department, if you go back, the department has been trying to amend the current tobacco legislation since about 2012. And the initial attempt was to introduce specifically what you are talking about, distance. And the distance that had been discussed at that time was about 10 meters from an operable opening. So if you go to your typical airport, you probably find that smokers are tossed somewhere in a very cold or hot place where no one cares or it can't really get inside the building. But that particular attempt at introducing that as a law was shelved. So currently what we are dealing with in practice are institutions making decisions by themselves to introduce a distance. So AXA would then introduce a distance because it's a responsible player or it's a responsible corporate, but it's not actually law that there should be a distance. Part of the resistance in 2012, at least a lot of the resistance came especially from liquor operators who were saying, if you go to townships especially, there isn't such a distance to speak of. If you go to Alexandra, for instance, if you see the density in Alexandra and just how congested the place is, you would essentially be asking patrons of watering establishments to travel quite a distance for them to smoke, because even if they move away from the facility itself, the neighbor is right next door and that neighbor is right next door, and it goes on and on. So you'll end up somewhere in an open felt. To enjoy a cigarette in a place like Alex, if you had to insist on a 10-meter radius for people to smoke.
Okay.
But to come back to your question of what the distance is going to be, at this point in time, we are assuming it's going to be 10 meters. But what's going to happen, which is important, especially where the vaping aspects of the bill are concerned, is that if you look even in the socio-economic impact assessment, which was published a week after the bill, which gives you the background rationale for it being introduced, it says there 6 months after the bill has been adopted by or signed by the president, it is expected that it will come into operation. In that 6-month period, the department is then expected to develop specific regulations that outline the specific details, because the bill itself is really just it's very broad outlines of how it must actually operate. But in practice, the department is going to then have to develop regulations, and distance or radius is one of the things it's going to have to specify and say, this is what we mean by distance. So at this point in time, there's no definite proposal on the table. The assumption is that it's going to be no less than 10 meters. And the assumption from the department's side is that those details will come out no more than 6 months after the bill has been adopted. Ordinarily, one would expect that process, sorry, I'm going on, but ordinarily one would expect that process to take about 18 months. But the department is of the view that there's going to be enough time between now and the signing of the bill into law to allow it to develop those regulations, and such that it does not have to take 18 months after adoption for the bill to become operational.
So there's a strong possibility that the department's guidelines may apply to, say, public buildings, but that institution owners or facility owners will be able to determine their own distance.
Only to the extent that they wish to increase it. I don't think they will have
to
reduce it. I think there will be a baseline below which no one is allowed to go. But of course, if you are a very Puritanian facility operator, then you can tell people you don't want them to vaporize within 100 meters of your entrance, in which case we won't come. But yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's important. That's important information. Thank you so much, Thembi. So then there's a few other things here as well that I certainly don't or haven't heard of yet that potentially could pass here. Any motor vehicle when a child under the age of 18 years in present, and there is more than one person in present in that vehicle. So, smoking in your own car with a kid in the car, or there's a little bit vague around here, but if there's another person in your car, it seems like that's going to be outlawed as well.
No, that's exactly the point I was trying to flag. I mean, this thing it's way too vague, and it's a bit impractical. I mean, let me just give you one example. Elsewhere, the bill talks about if there are more than one person present in the vehicle. Now, suppose I'm traveling with Thembi, for instance, in one vehicle to a meeting somewhere in Joburg. So the bill then, and both of us are vapors, then by implication, then now we're not allowed to vape. So that is sort of the impracticalities. I mean that we're trying to point out in terms of this bill, because it is way too reaching. It is way too reaching. Like I said in my conversation with somebody the other day, that when you have a problem of pest infestation in your home, you don't go out and get some explosive. I mean, to deal with the problem, and that's exactly what the bill seems to be doing here. The approach is that if it emits smoke, then it kills, and therefore you've got to ban it.
Can't hear you.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
It's me. Yeah, then, I mean, I didn't even think of it that way. Thanks, Fidel. That's something to consider. There's another one here, health facilities excluding rehabilitation centers. So are they saying that in rehabilitation centers, people are not supposed to be smoking? They need to be smoking outside of a rehabilitation center.
Look, I think generally, I mean, I suppose it depends what it means by a rehabilitation center first and foremost. But in a rehabilitation center, you more or less expect that people have more mobility, and those facilities are better able to comply with the requirements of the law, because there'd probably be an open space where people can walk out to in their robes and what have you. Or, whereas with hospitals, I don't know how hospitals operate currently, but I know there may be some hospitals that provide smoking places. But because there will now be no smoking, they're doing away with indoor smoking places. You may find that hospitals are going to struggle to provide smoking areas. But again, I mean, those people who are in hospital and who are mobile should probably be able to walk to some other parking area and enjoy their vapes if that's what they want to do. But I absolutely expect that there will be absolutely no vaping if it goes according to the script. If you do away with indoor emissions of any type, then certainly there will be no vaping in the bathroom for patients. So if you are hospitalized and you are not mobile, you are going to struggle to ingest your nicotine in vaporized form or any other form, except if it's a patch or any of these things.
Yeah, I think with rehab centers as well, there's another angle there, and that is that in terms of mental health, it's quite a common thing to have smoking in mental health places, because it was for many years deemed to be a form of self-medication and a way for people with depression or schizophrenia or whatever to help cope with the worst side effects of those conditions. That thinking is now changing a little bit. Doctors are now saying that nicotine can actually make things like anxiety worse. So it's kind of in a state of flux, but there are still some institutions that would encourage patients who are undergoing therapy there to actually take smoke breaks, because it settles them. If they're addicted to nicotine, you don't want them going into withdrawal while they are while they undergoing therapy and medication.
Treatment, yeah.
Look, I think I mean it depends on the science, I suppose. Probably Dr. Mutsualedi would be tempted to say that's quackery to encourage people to smoke for any reason whatsoever. My suspicion is that if there is science that says smoking can deal with some of the worst effects, those facilities will probably have to find alternatives rather quickly. And I think having said that, I think it's important also to draw a specific distinction. And that distinction is that as an organization, VPA is quite in favor of some or other regulation. The only thing that matters is what type of regulation is it? Is it practical? Is it easy to enforce? And does it allow for the industry to evolve and move to a point where it actually becomes beneficial? So you are able to deal with kitchen brews, for instance. You are able to ensure that underage vaping does not become a trend. But more importantly, that predominantly it's something accessed by smokers and not non-smokers. So that goes to messaging, that goes to marketing, that goes to all of those. If I may just say also, I think part of the motivation with categorizing vaping with tobacco in terms of public place smoking, it's not so much, to my mind at least, it's not so much the danger that vaping poses to bystanders, because that has not been established, because you would first have to establish the danger on a first-hand basis. And it's a subject we discussed yesterday at the VPA Media Roundtable. there's an attempt to regulate aesthetics, because there's this view that vaping may renormalize smoking, where up to now all efforts have been geared towards stigmatizing smoking. So there's this unfounded fear that Richard, producing his clouds there, may entice an under 18 to think vaping is a cool thing to embark on, and that over time, that young vapor will then progress to smoking tobacco. So the attempt here, more than anything, which is the irrational aspect of it, is to actually stigmatize. It's to put vaping in a corner and put it in the same category as smoking, such that non-vapers, non-smokers do not view it as a desirable habit. So it's not so much about what is the danger to a bystander, because there is no danger that has been established for a bystander. If you are vaping in your car now and I'm sitting there with Fidel, Fidel does not smoke, and I'm vaping my thing, and then Fidel is sitting there with me. One is a consenting adult, so if he does not like it that I'm vaping, he can get out of my car. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I mean, he may not like how the scent of any flavor that I'm vaping. He may not like the fact that it's sitting in a clouded or in a foggy vehicle. But ultimately, if we're dealing with public health, our view cannot be fixated on what Fidel likes, because there are a lot of things that Fidel will not like in life, including the smell of sulfur, right, when you pass through a leather tanning facility. The ultimate question we have to answer is, does my behavior endanger Fidel in any way? And the answer to that is that not according to the science as we have it. My vaping is probably less dangerous than Fidel being in the car in the first place. There's a higher chance of Fidel enjoying the scent and dying from a head-on collision while he's sitting in the car with me.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You know, that's exactly the points that we're alluding to over here. I mean, you can go through, page 10. All the laws that we are used to from a smoking perspective, all of those laws will now in somewhat way be applied to vaping as well. We are somewhat familiar with these laws. We went through a couple of them that's slightly different, and as Fidel also said, some of them are a little bit reaching, so we need to look at those. But if we look at this, so what we are dealing with here is smoking being classified as the same thing, and where currently smoking is prohibited, we'll also have vaping prohibited, right? But like Thembi is now saying, health risk for bystanders. We have all heard of secondhand smoking, but have we heard of anything like secondhand vaping? Is it harmful? ? So the science certainly doesn't support it being harmful, right? Of what I've read, the things I've read, but the anti-campaigners are calling it secondhand vape smoke or vapor smoke, and this is again a thing where they are clubbing smoking and vaping as the same thing. It's an attempt at that. So that's what the anti-campaigners are doing. They're calling it vapor smoke or, vape smoke. So the reason behind the anti-campaigners for blending secondhand smoke and secondhand vape smoke is the fear of renormalizing smoking, right?
Correct.
Richard, you've read a little bit about renormalizing smoking, right?
Yeah. This for me is the more pertinent point. I don't think there's much of a health argument. I mean, from what the science tells us at the moment, the risk is absolutely minimal, if anything. But I think the point of renormalizing smoking, I mean, if I think back to when I started smoking, everybody smokes in public. we had a cinema in Swaziland where I grew up, and if you walked into the cinema midway through, it looked like a hive of fireflies had descended on the cinema. You just saw these hundreds of orange glowing cigarettes, in the in the cinema. My parents smoked, my older siblings smoked, my schoolmates smoked, the older boys in school smoked, the teachers smoked. So when you're surrounded by it all day long, you kind of think it's normal. You see it the whole time, and you think, well, this is what grown-ups do. I want to, appear to be a grown-up, so let me take it up. It's a way to announce your independence when you become a teenager. It's a way to announce that you're now joining the adult world. So I think there is a valid point to be made there. It's finding the balance between individual rights and not sending the wrong kind of message. I mean, if I look at drugs is a very private thing. There are thousands of heroin addicts. There are thousands of recovering heroin addicts. I don't see anybody taking it in public. I don't see anybody taking methadone in public. It's waged as a very intensely private sort of thing. Now, I mean, that doesn't stop people doing it. America has an epidemic of opioid users at the moment. So it doesn't stop it. But at the same time, as a member of the public, I don't want to go into a mall and see people shooting up methadone. It's just...
It's crazy, yeah, of course not.
Yeah. Smoking less so, because it's a more socially accepted thing. But I can understand where the anti-tobacco people are coming from, saying that if you have a child who grows up not seeing adults around them, constantly puffing out clouds, whether it's smoke or vapor, it looks similar. It's puffing out clouds of stuff. And the thing is, even if they don't then transition to cigarettes from vaping, you still don't want them vaping. So, it's difficult to find a balance. The other aspect for me, which is very important, is the whole idea of something being a right, not necessarily making it the right thing to do.
Mm.
If you're allowed to vape in a mall, that's fine. It's convenient for you and so on. But to make an issue of it, to go where people are having coffee and to chuck massive clouds at them, which some vapors do deliberately. They go there and they make a big issue of their vaping because they now want to announce to the world that they have found this amazing new technology and they've got off cigarettes. So they put it in people's faces. And that is where I think the vaping community can play a big part as well. It's not just the law. It's about people understanding that everybody, it's not just your rights, it's about being considerate to others as well.
Look, I fully agree with that point, Richard. It's a very, very important point that you are making. We did touch on it yesterday, albeit briefly. I mean, because the approach that we're taking here in our engagement with this bill, it's a win-win kind of an approach. There are certain things, for instance, that we would support. I mean, one of them being the point that you have just made now, because it's a bit uncomfortable and unpleasant, really, to have a situation where when you walk around the mall, I mean, with your family, your children, and then you're walking behind the Thembi Fidel, for instance, and then he's busy vaping. I mean, what if we support that kind of behavior as the association, that would place us in a difficult situation in terms of engaging with the bill, because then immediately people will start saying, but then you are the same as your cousins. So when it comes to this particular aspect, for instance, I fully agree with you, and we will have to be championing communication in that aspect in terms of saying, there are a definite no-nos, for instance, when it comes to vaping. One of them being exactly the example that you have just made. You can't be having a situation where you're having breakfast with your family at Wimpy, for instance, and then somebody rocks up next to you and they start vaping. It's just socially unpleasant. And that is what we'll have to be communicating upfront as the association.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree. I think the point is finding the right balance. And I think our efforts should all be geared towards defining what the correct balance is. Because one, you don't want to stigmatize vaping, because then you deprive smokers of information in the process, because that's what ultimately is going to happen with the bill the way it is. We're not, I don't think any of us are asking for demonstrations. We're not asking for unlimited or carte blanche that you can vape wherever you are. The point is, let's find the right balance, because let's also not neglect the fact that it is a huge opportunity for public health, for the public health agenda. And that if we miscategorize the scientific evolution here, we risk missing out on a huge opportunity, and in the process, we risk endangering lives. Because one of the things that's going to happen, and it's an absolute certainty, if at a if the legal framework does not allow for communication, and this is the ultimate implication of the bill, if it's not easy for the industry to communicate the right forms of information about vaping, if you are put in the same basket as tobacco, I mean, right now you can't say anything about tobacco, right? I think some guys in the tobacco industry would want to tell you that, look, my cigarette is harm reduced, I've got this and the other type of filter, you get less of the carcinogens, yada, 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 yada. But that information can't be put out to anyone. As far as the public is concerned, all cigarettes are the same, except counterfeits, perhaps. But all cigarettes are the same. But if you spoke to the tobacco industry, they probably want to tell you not all cigarettes are the same. Now, you don't want to push vaping to the same situation where it's impossible to say this is a rubbish product, or this product is cleaner, it has A, B, C, it's safer in this respect, our gadget is this and the other one, all of those things. But of course, you can't then just have a carte blanche situation, as Fidel is saying and as Richard is saying, where I walk into a spur and I go to the the kiddies section where the kiddies are jumping to go look after my daughter, and I start making clouds there. Right? I think that's a common sense approach that we all have to accept. Let's not fight silly battles. It would be silly to fight for the right to make clouds in a space that's also occupied by non-vapers. But what we are saying is that within the bill, at the very least, you have to make it possible for the vapor to vape in an enclosed space.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are told. So what you currently have as a smoking lounge, if your desire ultimately is about doing away with the harm associated with tobacco, that is a fantastic desire, if that's your objective. But now your objective is not to regulate my ability or to make it impossible for me to vape, ultimately. If you have to hide me in a corner within, that's what you have to do. But of course, you are well within common sense and common decency to say, I can't just come into your hood or into your joint and start making all of these clouds and making everyone else feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can just pick up on that, one of the major things for me, and I've heard this from a lot of vapers, is unhappiness at being put together with smokers in a corporate smoking place. What is VPA ASA's stance on this? Would you be lobbying employers to provide a separate area for vapers? I mean, I know it's a lot of overhead and logistics and so on for employers to provide two separate smoking areas. But this, for me, would be an entirely justified move for an employer to take, that they have one area for smokers and a different area for vapers, because I mean, vapers have started vaping precisely to avoid
exactly.
tobacco
Smoking.
smoke.
Yeah.
I think Fidel, you'll come in just now. I think there's a one. I think something. If the law ultimately does not do away with indoor facilities, you are probably going to end up, as more and more people pick up vaping, you are probably going to end up with at least those employers that have wellness and what have you, programs and what have you, you are probably going to end up with an organic process where smoking lounges are rather converted into vaping lounges, partly as a ploy to move people out of tobacco and into vaping, to say you can't smoke, but you can vape indoors. But I think it's going to be near impossible, probably unreasonable, to ask any employer to designate a vaping joint in their to have both a vaping joint and a smoking joint. One, space may just not allow for it, but the cost associated with putting it together may also be prohibitive. So I think if the law ultimately does not do away with it, you're going to have one of two things. You're either going to have a smoking lounge or you're going to have a vaping lounge. But I think over time, as more people switch to vaping and as employers hear more about the harm-reduced nature of vaping, and once we do away with all the confusion around the harms associated with vaping, you're going to have more employers organically switching towards vaping lounges in the workplace and doing away with smoking lounges.
Yeah, sure. No, I agree with that point, TK.
Has there been any move that you've seen on your part? I mean, you talked about corporations having wellness programs and so on. Has there been any sort of incentive to move people across to vaping, or is it still too new and the benefits aren't widely known enough?
No, it's still way too new. I mean, I'm not really aware. I mean, of any measures that the corporates are pursuing at this stage. I mean, as part of perhaps influencing their employees. I mean, to switch into vaping, but perhaps as part of the ongoing engagement, because if, for instance, you'd want to look at the benefits, the long-term benefits of vaping to your employees as an employer. The costs that, for instance, are associated with traditional smoking products like tobacco, for instance, where people, and in this case employees, for instance, are susceptible to certain diseases, I mean, which may be chronic. And in the long term, I think, as Thembi was saying, it may be in the interest of employers themselves, I mean, to convert what are currently used as smoking lounges or areas, I mean, into vaping areas. But then it may be a bit of a difficult fight to put up. But in the long term, I mean, it would indeed, in my view, benefit the employers.
Okay, so there's another point that, you know, I think we're pretty deep in that discussion. But there's another point I wanted to talk about, just to bring us back to, you know, the risk here. So as we've seen smoking disappear out of the public eye, and even in places like box office movie films, right, or box office films, the risk of smoking being sensationalized by movie stars has died out. But of late, we have seen vaping making its way into movies, obviously bypassing the existing advertising laws, right? Now, you know, there's been a lot of commentary around this, there's a risk involved here. We don't want to, the anti-campaigners, they don't want to renormalize smoking or vape smoke, right? But now what we're seeing is vaping, making its way into box office films. So what is the comments around that? Is that okay, or is that not okay?
Look, I was watching a comedy series, Dave Chappelle. I think he did that early this year in New York or something.
Yeah.
And this dude rocks up with a device, and he's vaping throughout his I think it was a 1 hour show, and he was vaping right through the thing. It was not making clouds. It was not a heavy duty device. But I think one of the things that we have to accept to some extent is that at this particular moment, there's probably a more permissive attitude in society in terms of looking at vaping, right? Because there's a cool factor about vaping. There is this cool factor about vaping that people are still fascinated with. They may not understand the health, the science, and what have you, but aesthetically, I think at this point in time, vaping does not occupy the same category as smoking in people's minds. It smells nice, smells like donuts, you're making me hungry, that kind of nonsense. So that's what it is right now. And the objectives of public health and the anti-tobacco lobby right now is to deal with the renormalization conversation. And movies, of course, are probably one of the best vehicles for promoting any form of behavior or any form of habit, if your objective is to do that. So I think legally, it's not so much about what's in a movie. It's about what is our attitude to it. And if our attempt is at stigmatizing and saying we don't want to see it associated with positive forms of behavior, then that's what's going to happen. So it will occupy the same level of thinking that you don't want to see it. You want to see as little of it as you possibly can. So we are probably going to end up in South Africa, at least, in a situation where you don't see a lot of vaping in our locally produced, if the law passes as it is. We are going to inevitably end up in a situation where vaping tobacco will be viewed as the same thing, and you're going to see less vaping. We don't see any of it at this point in time, I suppose. But it's not going to become a normal thing to see people vaping in movies. As an organization, I don't think we want to deal with whether or not people are vaping in movies per se, but we want to ensure that the product is categorized or is not miscategorized. We want to be able to advertise responsibly, the same way that you are able to advertise alcohol currently, right? We don't want to have the same ban that you currently have on tobacco, because what we are saying is that at this point in time, the objective is about sharing information. The objective is about making sure that as many people as possible understand that they have an alternative to tobacco. Not they must take up vaping. No, the objective is to say to people, you can get your nicotine fix without smoking. And one of the things that came out yesterday, which was a very good intervention by Dr. Hosi Litlape, was that the industry itself needs to look at emissionless forms of vaping, because that's one of the ways we are going to deal with issues of aesthetics. Now, as a vapor myself, I don't necessarily insist on the clouds. I insist on the flavor. I insist on the nicotine. That's what I insist on. I don't insist on the on creating a cloud. And I'm pretty sure somewhere in the world, there's someone who's got enough brain cells to figure out a next generation product that's going to allow me to vape without creating the cloud. So where I don't necessarily simulate the behavior of smoking, but I do ingest. It probably works out as simulating an asthma inhaler. You know, because people with asthma inhale this thing and they don't let out any emissions afterwards. So over time, I'm pretty sure we're going to get to that stage where it's choice assorted almost. You know, you can end up with a device that does not create a cloud. And will it look uncomfortable then if someone is vaping an emissionless device in a movie? Let's be careful about what we are regulating.
Not sure.
It will certainly make tricking competitions interesting. Vaporless vapes. Just imagine I'm doing a jellyfish. You can't actually see it, but
it's there.
But on this issue of vaping in movies and so on, I read an interesting article. I mean, one doesn't know how much of it is just projection or how much is actually fact, but one thing I always wondered was why vaping didn't leverage celebrities who are doing it. Now, you've got two big ones. You've got Leonardo DiCaprio and you've got Tom Hardy, are the two big vaping celebs. And apparently there's a lot of people in fashion as well, fashion models, supermodels and so on, who vape as well. And they asked them, they said, would you be willing to go out and advocate and so on? And they said, absolutely not. They said it is such an emotionally loaded subject that they don't want anything. I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio is happy to vape in public, but he said he will rather stick needles in his eyes than go out and say to people, take this up. It's just, he is going to get such pushback if he does it from, anti-tobacco groups and so on, that the celebs have just basically been pushed into a corner, and they can't, they don't want to be associated with it, which is unfortunate, but it's how it is.
Okay, so I think what I want to ask the viewers out there is, vaping in public. Now that we've covered, a decent portion or most of what is being said around vaping in public, is it a good or is it a bad idea to allow this? And should you be doing it or shouldn't you be doing it? So please leave your comments below in the video, and we'll get back to you on that. And as far as I'm concerned about that, I don't think, I think there should be designated areas for us to vape in, for us to smoke in. But as far as vaping in public, vaping in malls, vaping in places where people are, we shouldn't be doing that. If somebody is next to you and they don't appreciate that, it's always common courtesy to make sure that they are okay with it. We should be acting like that as the public, right?
Yeah. I think there's still going to be a lot of work and a lot of public awareness that's going to take place on this subject, because, like we said, right at the beginning, this is a fairly new thing that we're dealing with, because Thembi, for instance, earlier on was talking about the issue of arrangements in terms of workplace smoking or vaping, for instance. Because I'm thinking as I'm sitting here now, if somebody decides to switch from smoking to vaping, one, they're trying to improve their health. That's one. Two, it's more about the social benefits that are associated, for instance, with vaping. One of them being Thembi, smelling better, for instance. Those sort of things. Now, if, for instance, I, out of my own volition, as part of improving my own health, switch from tobacco smoking to vaping, but then when I go to my workplace, then I get lumped together with the very same product that I was trying to run away from. I don't know what your thoughts are, Richard. So that is why I'm saying there's still going to be a lot of public awareness that is going to be needed in this regard. And I expect corporates to play an active role in this process from the point of view of health and wellness. I don't know what your thoughts are, gentlemen, on this issue.
My ideal end game for this would be that vaping is still allowed not in public place, not in malls where people are walking and so on, but that there are a lot of vaping places available, but that the community has the consideration and the respect and the insight to not abuse that privilege. That I think is, it's such a difficult thing because, you're dealing with teenagers who are, in any case, rebellious. They want to make statements. They want to be anti-authority and so on. But I think that is where vaping and regulation could meet halfway, that, don't outlaw it everywhere where smoking is outlawed. Make it easier for people to vape than to smoke, because that is the ultimate goal, is to transition people across. Make it easier for people to vape than to smoke, but for vapers to have the insight and to be humble and knowledgeable enough to not abuse that privilege.
Sure.
All right, guys. That pretty much wraps up, vaping in public. Is there any final comments before we close the show?
Well, from our side, as the association, we're going to be engaging thoroughly with the Department of Health. Thembi will probably talk on the process in terms of finalizing our submissions on the bill. And then we expect the same kind of engagement from the department, and our hope is that that engagement will be based on nothing else, but will be based purely on science.
Absolutely, and I think there's the closing date for the comments is now the 9th of August. The end of the 3-month comment period, public comment period, is 9th August. So that's the first phase of the bill making process. At some point, probably late next year after the elections, the bill will be introduced in Parliament, assuming the Department of Health works expeditiously after the elections next year to introduce the bill in Parliament. That will open up a second opportunity, especially for organizations such as VPA, to the Africa Harm Reduction Alliance, to go and make inputs into the bill process. It's also important to understand that what the department has put out currently is a proposal. It encapsulates its thinking on the subject matter, and we have a responsibility, first as an organization, as the industry, and thirdly as consumers, to put out our perspective on what we think is the ideal scenario. Now, what is not going to wash with the department is precisely what we are saying. Someone going there and saying, we want to vape in malls. You are wasting ink, you are wasting your data. It's not going to wash because it just won't get any support from anywhere. It's not smart. It's not smart. But what you do want to talk about is in making your inputs, it's to reflect your own experiences with vaping, especially if you've noticed a change in your health since especially if you are not a dual user, if you are purely a vapor, because then your benefits increase significantly. There are no benefits if you are a dual user. You want to put out that type of testimonial to the department. VPA is coordinating the process of collating those testimonials, all of which will then be submitted to the Department of Health on behalf of all those who have made those inputs. But of course, I mean, VPA is not a gateway. There is an email address that has been provided by the Department of Health where we can all submit our own inputs. I think it's linm@health.gov.za, where we can all put out our own testimonials, where we can put out our own objections. But also, importantly, it's not about objecting, it's about refining. Let's make specific proposals, you know. It's not a very intelligent exercise to say, I don't like this. You know, that's a fairly childish behavior. Kids will tell you they don't like broccoli, and then that's the end of the subject where they are concerned. Point of it is, why do you not like it, and what would you prefer? Because this is a collaborative process, it's democratic policy making. And one of the other things I think we need to absolutely get through our heads, which I've found sometimes it's lost on people. The Department of Health is well within its mandate to regulate any behavior it considers to be a danger to public health. So they are not being crazy. You know, this is not some Stalinist exercise or the government trying to control our lives. That's not the point. The point of it is, how do we create a society that we can all live in, that we can all live long lives, that we can reduce the cost of public health. If tobacco is a big contributor to the cost of managing health, how do we reduce it, and how does vaping play a part? So we need to make those inputs. Those of us who are vested in or who are well versed in scientific matters, who are able to read some of the science around vaping, let's do so, and let's put out our comments, because we want to strengthen our position as much as possible based on evidence. And the accusation we are making against the department, all of us, is that it has disregarded a lot of the evidence that is out there. Let's point this out, and let's ensure the department is aware of the trends, of all the body of knowledge that is being generated from all over the world, so that the department is in a position to evaluate and make proper choices about what ultimately it puts out in front of Parliament. When it gets into Parliament, it becomes a different ball game altogether. Parliament is there as a representative of the people, and they have a responsibility to sift through all the different perspectives, including the perspective that is of the Department of Health, because we must keep in mind, Parliament is not an extension of government. Parliament is a place where our views get articulated by the people we have elected to represent our views. We may not like the way they are elected in the form that we currently conduct our elections, but they are there to represent our views in some or other formulation. So when we get to Parliament, we'll then have a responsibility to know who represents us and to make sure that they understand what our view is, and they are able to engage with the proposal that's put in front of them with a view on what is best for society. Not what is best for government, but what is best for society, what has the most benefit, what has the least amount of risk, and what is most practical.
Perfect.
I think the bottom line is that you want to pick the battles you can win. Don't pick the battles you can't win.
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay,
just
guys. Yeah.
Sorry. Just one more question. Thembi, you talked about Parliament being the voice of the people through elected representatives and so on. I emailed that address that was given with the bill, Lynn, at the Department of Health. I raised an objection specifically to the ban of online sales, but I prefaced that with my own experience in vaping. So it was kind of a testimonial plus a suggestion at the same time. would you, as VP ASA, encourage people to contact their MPs as well, or rather go directly via the department, or rather go directly via VP ASA website, or all three?
At this point in time, sorry, Fidel. At this point in time, I would probably tell you are wasting your time contacting your representative, because the matter is not in front of Parliament.
Yeah, sure.
So it's important to keep the distinction in mind that Parliament, government, those two are not extensions of each other. Those act completely separately and independently. They work together, but they're separate and independent. So until the matter has been tabled in front of Parliament, MPs would be encroaching on the responsibility of government if they went to government and said, we don't like your thinking. So they don't have the standing currently to go to government and engage government on its thinking. The matter will be handed over to them when the bill is tabled in Parliament. Up until that point, you are probably wasting your time contacting your representative. In terms of the manner in which you conduct your submission, you can email Lynn directly. You can also supplement that with a submission via VPA. It really, you don't have to choose one or the other. In fact, I would encourage all of us to use both mechanisms to increase our chances of getting eyeballs.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Thembi and Fidel, for joining us for the show. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, TK. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Okay.